Hi, I'm going to show you in this movie how RAM 7.5 significantly improves the way teams deliver and consume software. So let's start with one concrete consumption example. When you develop a piece of code, you will use source control to manage the change for the code that you are developing. Check in, check out, split string, merge, things like that. But gone are the days that everyone builds everything from scratch. With open source components, common components, regardless if they are Dojo widget or NoSGR bundles, it is not a good practice for each development team to check in various versions of those binaries into their source control. It will be hard to understand who is using what, and even harder to try to get everyone to use the same version of something, or notifying their consumers that fixes are available and make sure everybody gets the same fixes. This is where library come into place. So if you have a reusable library, a WSDL, a model from an internal project or a third party, I can search for one that is approved for me to use and link it to my IDE, reference it. This is a literal link in the sense that what will be checked into source control is the link information for this artifact. RAM Eclipse tooling and an automated build will fetch this link as needed. Okay, so I could use the library to link to these artifacts, but what does it mean to publish artifacts to the library? For one thing, you do not want to dump your kitchen sink into the library, and as you place artifacts in the library, you want to organize them as neatly as possible and make them part of the library's catalog. But what does it take to catalog these artifacts? Mostly, the artifacts that you place in a library are packaged a certain way depending on the type of that package. The package's type determines what kind of information the package holds. For example, if you are to package an asset of type service specification, a WSDL if you will, we may need to require a business owner work items that are associated with that service, and when the WSDL or XSDs are published, extract information like the tag namespace, operations, and such. The next thing is to define what kind of content that package must contain. Standardizing on this is key. If you define a categorization schema tree, you could specify that a particular asset type is to be classified manually or let RAM drive it from the content of that package. This enables RAM to make it simpler to search for that asset as well as determine how that asset is managed. Relationships are also very important as part of the packaging process. One obvious relationship is a dependency relationship. That is, this package is dependent on another package. It can be an install dependency or a usage dependency like this one over here, a WSDL that requires an XML schema. RAM in 7.5.1 understands SOS services out of the box. It will populate attributes and verify content. Since this particular service that I just uploaded requires a schema that is not already in RAM and was not uploaded, the policy associated with this type of asset will fail. Catalogs works well as long as assets are packaged and annotated properly. You can automate many of these things with out-of-the-box or RAM extensions. But an important aspect of keeping the library up to date is by configuring appropriate lifecycle for the various asset types. So, what is a lifecycle? You could define a workflow which is a set of states and transitions and configure a lifecycle for that workflow. A lifecycle specifies when this workflow is applicable and what is to be done in each of its states. Base lifecycles are defined on the repository level. Base lifecycle can specify a set of rules that are driven across communities. Community administrators can extend base lifecycle and further specify how to drive assets in their communities. I can select the base, or as we call it in RAM, a master lifecycle, and further customize it. I cannot modify inheritance configuration set on the repository level. On each state, you could specify who is to be reviewing this asset. And you could provide instructions so that when a reviewer gets notified with a link to this asset, they can understand what is that need to be done. You could also configure policies. You could mark the state so that the reviewer is private. The discussion would only be viewed by reviewers. And you could override the default permission for that asset in this state. Based on what is happening on a particular state, you could define if a transition leaving the state is available or not. Policies are thread of execution code that runs on a lifecycle state. They typically verify packaging content. For example, a new out-of-the-box policy is the service validation policy. When this policy executes, it will look for the asset's content, and for any SOA-related artifacts, it will validate structure, but also it will verify that all dependencies can be resolved either within that asset or related assets. But a policy is only limited to verify an asset's packaging content. You could create custom policies that integrate with the overall lifecycle. Assume here that we have a build process that published a candidate golden build to RAM. Assuming here that it passes unit tests, the build also approved the asset. I can see it over here from the web UI and see from the content that the deliverable is linked to the build job. On the approval process, this lifecycle requires one more approval from the QA person. This will move the asset to the next state, the release candidate state. On this state, there is a policy that will invoke an automation system. We use BuildForge in this example that will deploy this asset into a deployment environment. RAM has a few policies out of the box like that. The service request policy will open a ticket for the Tivoli Service Request Manager. When an application asset reaches a particular state, it will kickstart a deployment process in operations. You could easily extend RAM with custom policies like that. Permissions are also an important ingredient of how you manage your library content. RAM provides fine-grained permission on who could create, see, or download content, as well as who could search on what. These are generic type of rules that you could specify for a certain type of asset or category. Permission could also be specified directly on an asset, but it could also be changed dynamically as the asset moves through its life cycle. For example, when an asset is approved, it may not be modified anymore. The last aspect of a library is the share part. Beyond the fact that you could link to assets, access them from scripts, a REST or Java API, it is also about the ability to find what you're looking for. The ability to Google search and use in-context facets and tags to refine your search is key. Note that RAM does provide the ability to query for specific attribute values as well as artifact content. Another important aspect in browsing through information is relationships, which enable one to understand the collections of assets that are typically delivered as part of a release. Staying connected to activities on RAM can be done by pulling information using RSS feeds on searches, specific assets, forums, and such, or going to the dashboard. But you could also get notification pushed to you from RAM by subscribing to search results or assets, or designating which events you're interested on. Collaboration is another facet of sharing. The asset review process provides a common thread that can be shared amongst collaborators or opened up amongst anyone that has detailed access to the asset. Asset could also be associated with a discussion forum. This is a more generic discussion around the asset versus the asset creation as in the review process. Threads in this discussion can be linked to an OSLC change management like RTC and CQ to link the thread to a work item. Consider a bug thread. This will provide a way to link a user to a developer without the need to understand which server to link to. If you're familiar with RAM, you probably noticed a lot of new things in the various flybys. If you want to see more details of what's new in 7.5.1, you could get it from the download page. So come visit us at Jazz.net.